Okay, so what we're going to do is have a quick 10-minute review of the content you need to be familiar with for tomorrow's test. Starting off, we are going to look at the very beginning when we talked about the rise of the dictators, and in particular we talked about the fascist dictators Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. The thing to remember about the fascist is that the state was more important than the individual. Individual who did not work towards the state was an enemy of the state and could be amply punished. For Adolf Hitler, he targeted the Jews as the main problem with Germany in the post-World War I years. And in addressing this issue, we're going to see the emergence of various laws to strip citizenship from German Jews. The first of these is going to be the Nuremberg laws, which took away the citizenship of German Jews, and it's going to kind of work its way up till we reach the Wannsee Conference, in which the Jewish problem, otherwise known as the final solution, was laid out. Now, we now know the final solution was basically the extermination of German Jews and other undesirables or enemies of the state. Okay, and with this map here, we had talked about it in class previously. The final solution kind of took place in various camps, known as concentration camps or in death camps. Now, while you're going through this, look back on your notes and find this particular map, okay? Because you'll look at where the various camps were located. We've got our concentration camps within Germany, and then we've got those death camps in Eastern Europe, in Poland. Think about why that is the case. Why would Germany put those death camps outside of its borders and have the concentration camps inside of its borders? While all this was happening in Europe, the Americans basically wanted to stay out of any kind of European entanglements, okay? Just like prior to World War I. We didn't want to get caught up in any kind of things that were going on in Europe. We had fought in World War I. We were a little bit disillusioned by some of the outcomes and involvement of American businesses and aiding the Germans during that time period. And we really felt that European entanglements were something that we did not want to get involved in. So we're going to have a series of neutrality acts that are going to be passed. And they're basically addressing some of the worries of American citizens and Congress people that the U.S. might get dragged into another war in Europe should things get to be a little bit more worse than what they were. And also Congress is going to pass a series of neutrality acts designed to keep America out of war in Europe. Well, despite our best efforts, or maybe because our lack of involvement, war did come to Europe. And Germany is going to invade Poland in 1939, and they are going to unleash a new form of warfare. This form of warfare is known as the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And basically what the Blitzkrieg is a combination of armor units, light infantry, and air power working simultaneously to overwhelm the opponents. Germany will use this to great effect against the Polish army. And once Poland is defeated and they turn their forces towards the French and the British on the continent, they will use it with great effect against them as well. So great will this effect be that the British and French troops will get bottled up in a town known as Dunkirk, a little harbor town on the English Channel. Surrounded and facing annihilation, the British Admiralty called up for every single floating vessel that could traverse the English Channel to come over and try and rescue the British and French troops trapped in Dunkirk. Fortunately, they were able to evacuate some 300,000 troops and save them from being captured and destroyed by the German army. This little action was known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. With the defeat of Poland and the defeat of France, and with British being up against the ropes against the Germans, American neutrality in 1939 was starting to come to an end. We recognized things were getting a little bit tough in Europe, that our best ally, Great Britain, was in great trouble and we needed to start doing something to help. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Japanese were out grabbing territory for themselves. They had invaded China and they had sent troops into French Indochina as well. Now, each time the Japanese went ahead and invaded something or did something that the United States didn't quite like or didn't quite agree with, the United States would slap on some sort of sanction against the Japanese. Whether it's getting steel, preventing them from getting steel shipments, or coal, or other types of raw materials that the Japanese needed to fight a war, okay, the United States would go ahead and put a sanction on that particular item. The idea was to prevent the Japanese from further aggression in that area. The effect of it in actuality was that the Japanese realized that they had to do something to prevent the Americans from holding up their overall ambitions. And on December 7th, 1941, they did just that. They attacked Pearl Harbor on a date which Franklin Roosevelt would say would live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was very successful. A large part of the American Navy was knocked out of action. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. They were on patrol off of the coast of California. Wanting to destroy the American aircraft carriers, the Japanese planned an attack on the island of Midway to draw the aircraft carriers into one final battle in which they would destroy the Americans' forces. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Americans had broken their secret code and knew of the attack. So they, in turn, set a trap for the Japanese. In a 6-day battle, the Japanese would lose 4 aircraft carriers to 1 American aircraft carrier. Along with that, they would lose 240 aircraft and over 3,000 sailors, compared to the Americans' 150 aircraft and 307 sailors. The important thing to remember here is that the Battle of Midway marked the furthest part of Japanese aggression in the Pacific. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese would be on the defensive for the remainder of the war. Was it an easy battle from here on out? No. It was actually very difficult, and we will talk about that in the next few slides. Let's go back to the fighting in Europe. In spring of 1941, the Germans broke their non-aggression pact and invaded Europe. This was known as Operation Barbarossa. Their objective, aside from taking the Russian capital of Moscow, was to take one of the key strategic locations in Russia known as Stalingrad. They were hoping to get Stalingrad because it was a key transportation hub, and it was named after their leader, Joseph Stalin. To win Stalingrad would be a great victory for Germany. By February of 1943, German supply was cut off, Hitler had forbade the German troops to withdraw, and the Russians came on strong. By the end of that month, over 91,000 German troops surrendered to the Russian forces. The key takeaway from the Battle of Stalingrad is that it marked the last or an end to Germany's advances in eastern Russia. It was also the first major German loss during the Second World War, and after the German lost Stalingrad, they did not advance any further into Eastern Europe or Russia for the remainder of the war. This is very similar to the Battle of Midway, after which Japanese expansion in World War II came to an end. World War II was a war fought on 2 fronts. One was against the Germans in Europe, the other against the Japanese in the Pacific. There was an agreement between the Allied forces that they would work to defeat the German army first, then turn around and try and defeat the Japanese. Despite this agreement, there were still differences on how the war should proceed. Roosevelt wanted an immediate attack on the European continent. So did Stalin. He wanted the Americans to help take some of the heat off of them with regards to the Germans. Churchill knew that the American army was good, but he knew that they were not quite as good as they thought that they were, and thought that the Americans should get some experience in basic modern warfare. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that they should go ahead and move then towards an invasion of North Africa. And we'll see Operation Torch take place during November of 1942. Again, this was an opportunity for American troops to learn how to fight in a modern war. At the Tehran Conference, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt sat down and came up with some agreements on how the war should proceed. During this time period, the Russians agreed to launch a full-scale offensive against the Germans once the Allies landed in Europe. In addition, they agreed to support the U.S. in their fight against the Japanese after the Germans were defeated, and that they would take part in an international peacekeeping agency after the war. The invasion of continental Europe came on June 6, 1944, a day known as the Longest Day. The Allied forces invaded Normandy in France. The Germans had anticipated them invading the Pas-de-Calais. Because of its close proximity to England, the Germans were really convinced that that's where the invasion was going to be. When the invasion forces came towards Normandy beaches, the Germans were taken by surprise. Back in the Pacific, the Americans were using a strategy known as island hopping, where they would move from island to island to island to move their forces closer towards Japan. The closer the American forces got to Japan, the more fierce the Japanese defenses of their homeland. By the time we reach the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese are going to introduce kamikaze pilots, also known as the Divine Wind, to attack American ships. Kamikazes were pilots who flew airplanes loaded with explosives into the side of American ships in an attempt to sink them. While these battles were going on in both Europe and in the Pacific, the Americans had been working on a top-secret project known as the Manhattan Project. The idea behind this project was to develop the world's first atomic bomb. Because of heavy casualties in fighting the Japanese in the Pacific Islands, the United States finally made the decision that they would use an atomic bomb to help bring the war to an end. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. 2 days later, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and 2 days after that, the Japanese surrendered. World War II had come to an end. Two other things you're going to want to review for tomorrow's test. One, the concept of the double V, victory at home and victory abroad. But who was this victory for, and what did it represent? The other thing is the image of Rosie the Riveter. What was the purpose of this poster? What group of individuals were we trying to motivate for the war effort? That pretty much concludes this quick review for the World War II test. There will be some things on the test that I didn't cover in this video, but those are things that you should have gone over through your chapter readings and completion of the assignments. Good luck to you this evening, and better luck to you tomorrow.